Get to know Janet Mills on News Radio WGAN.
We're back again here on WGAN, and we are being joined here now by gubernatorial candidate, Democratic candidate for governor, Janet Mills, who's here to tell us a little bit more about herself and her run for governor.
How
Janet,
you doing?
Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We are pleased to have you here. So we're doing these, of course, for all the candidates that are running this year. And one, as I was telling you before we started here, one of our main goals is to get to know you a little bit better, because when we see TV commercials in 30 seconds and you see debates and you have a minute and a half to answer a question.
Yeah. Last time I was here, I think there was 7 of us in a studio, and we were all cramped in like sardines trying to get.
And you didn't get much time to talk, did you?
No, we didn't. Oddly enough. We had some repartee, but
well, I think it's a shame that we don't actually get to know the people behind it. When you're talking about how politics is today, it's so mean-spirited, and there's so much poison, it seems like, involved there. Getting to know the person on the other side and realize that they're not actually the worst person who ever lived is not a bad idea. So we want to get to know you all. And so that's what we're here for. And we'd like to hear, of course, what you want to do for the state and everything, but we want to get to know you too. So my first question to you, just I guess lead off, is take us back to the very, very beginning. You have a very political family. Obviously,
some of them.
Yeah, you do, and there's a lot of history there, and I'd love to hear sort of your perspective on your early life and kind of what it was like to grow up in a family that valued public service like that, and how you kind of caught the bug yourself and how you got involved in all this.
Yeah, I was a late comer to this whole thing. Actually, I never dreamed of being in politics. Never dreamed of running for office when I was a kid. Never dreamed of being a lawyer. I mean, women were not lawyers when I was growing up. There were no women lawyers, really, 1 or 2 in the whole state. So I grew up in the shadows of Margaret Chase Smith. We were in Farmington, Maine, and she was down the road in Skowhegan. And I remember, delivering postcards and pamphlets for her along the streets in Farmington, and later in Gorham, where I also went to school when my father was U.S. attorney, and doing, campaign work for her in the nitty-gritty way, the retail fashion. And there's a picture of her sitting on our front porch in a rocking chair, holding a 6-month-old baby girl, black and white photo, and that was me. So she visited our home quite often. I remember in 1955, I was a small child, and we were asked us kids were asked to stand in front of the picket fence on High Street and wave and wave and wave. And I said, "Who we waving to, Mama? Who we waving to?" And she said, "The President of the United States." And it was when Dwight D. Eisenhower was coming back from Parmacini Lake and Rangeley, celebrating the bicentennial or centennial of Rangeley, and he fished. He was doing some fishing at the head of Parmacini Lake at a place called Little Boy Falls, where I've fished since then. There's a plaque there, placed there by the Franklin County Republican Women's Club, to commemorate where President Dwight D. Eisenhower caught a trout. Right. I don't know what kind of fly he was using. But anyway, he and Margaret Chase Smith were coming. He was heading to Margaret Chase Smith's house, Senator Smith's house in Skowhegan, and they made the turn down our little road and crossed in front of our house in Farmington. So my family were Republicans, like most of Western Maine growing up, a lot of Maine growing up. But frankly, they were...
Well, it's quite a bit different in the... A lot of people don't realize that, up until really Ed Muskie, the mid-50s and 60s and 70s, when the transition really happened, it was a very Republican state,
It was, and they were Teddy Roosevelt type of Republicans.
Right.
They believed in conservation. They believed in protecting the environment. They believed in equal rights and justice, and they believed in protecting people. And they also were sort of fiscally responsible people. So, and when I was in school, I entered some public speaking contests, and I was asked to memorize Margaret Chase Smith's Declaration of Conscience speech, with which I won some speaking contests. Anyway, so it was fun growing up there. I mean, my father was working hard. He was a small town lawyer and later a U.S. attorney for the state of Maine under Eisenhower, Nixon, and Ford. And my mother was a school teacher for 37 years. She taught high school English. So we were forced to learn, writing, grammar, spelling, writing, all those things. Encouraged, I should say.
But you said you came late to the party, so to speak, on public service. Yeah. You were obviously exposed to it an awful lot. But you said that you didn't really think you were going to go into that when you were young. What did you think you were going to do?
Here's what I was exposed to. My father would come home from work, and lawyers, they didn't spend full time practicing law. They had to do other stuff like real estate, insurance, things like that. My father would come home and say that he he had a fee due to him from a client, and he would take the fee in chickens or some other, it was bartering. And so he would come home with a load of chickens sometimes. You go, really? But, we grew up down the street from my grandparents. My grandmother was from Farmington, going back, her family, a few hundred years. My grandfather, my father's side, was from Stonington. So we always made treks to Stonington in the summer to visit the relatives there. And my mother was from Ashland, up in the county, mid-county. And her father, my grandparents, whom I spent a lot of time with as a kid, all my summer vacations, all my school vacations I spent with my grandparents in Ashland. And he was a potato farmer, had a couple hundred acres in the middle of Ashland. When that went under, he ran a hardware store in Ashland, and then later became a town clerk. So I would go up there and spend my summers and help him write marriage licenses and fishing licenses and dog licenses, and hope I didn't get them mixed up.
Right. So I could blame you if anybody got a typo on those. Sure.
You got a dog license, you wanted to get married.
Yeah. So sort of from there, when you were thinking about what you were going to do next, I mean, when you were growing up, what was it? What was your dream back then? Well,
I started school early. I went to the Catholic school because you get in when you're 4 years old and you didn't have to wait till you were 5, and skipped kindergarten. So I graduated high school when I was 17, went to college when I was 17. I really was too young to be in college. I spent a year and a half at Colby, and I dropped out. And I wanted to see the world. I knew there was stuff going on outside of Maine, and so I went out to the West Coast and stayed there about 9 or 10 months, worked in an insurance company, and spent time hanging out with people in San Francisco. It was great. Came back east, and I was in school, out of school, in school. I took night courses here and there. Ended up going to UMass Boston. I spent a year working in a psychiatric hospital as a psychiatric aide. That was an eye-opener, Got to know the downside of life and people with serious problems and how to deal with them with compassion, hopefully, and goodwill.
And that was just a job you took to get along while you were kind of discovering stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
But
it taught you a lot while you were there.
Taught me a lot. And ended up going to UMass Boston when it was still downtown. It was a fairly new campus downtown. You could walk to classes. There was no football team, no sports, no fraternity sororities. So it was just going to school. I think I got about a 4.0 average that year. I did well. I just focused on school. I had been working, so I knew the value of going to school.
Yeah.
Appreciated school a lot more.
It's kind of funny how you come to that later in life, isn't it?
I think most kids should take a year off in between high school and college and learn what it is to work.
Yeah.
I mean, I worked during high school. I always had a paper route when I was a kid. Had a paper route in Farmington. Later had a paper route in Gorham. I worked slinging hash and serving meatloaf and mac and cheese at the Farmington, the Shiretown Diner, as a teenager. And of course, everybody smoked back then. That was gross too. But that's how I got to know my neighbors and my community, working there. So then I didn't even think about going to law school for a long time. I ended up going to Paris for a year because it was cheaper to go to Paris and study with the University of Massachusetts. Cheaper to spend a year there than to live in Boston another year.
So when you were in Boston, what was your actual major? Was it like
English,
pre-law?
English until I graduated with a degree in French. Came back from Paris with enough courses to graduate in French. So what the heck? Why not? Got done school. So and then I worked in Cambridge for a year, and I went to I worked in Washington as a receptionist and a secretary, and then a paralegal in a patents law firm for 2 years. They discovered I could read and write French, so I ended up translating patents. I hope I did a good job.
So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that we can blame on you, right? If you
right. Well, if the patent goes wrong, so I did that, and I realized, hey, I could do this. I could practice law.
Yeah,
be a lawyer.
So that was your exposure to it that
That's
really
right.
kind of got you the bug.
And my father had talked to me about going into law. He said, you could do this. I said, really, me? Never thought of it before. And my brother Peter had started law school, and his wife Meg, at the time, was in law school. So I came back to Maine to go to law school.
And then went from there. I know that
the rest is history,
yeah, the rest is, I guess, history. I mean, you were assistant attorney general in 1976, and then kind of it went from there.
I graduated in 1976, and I got a job in the AG's office. First woman in the criminal division of the Attorney General's office. I ended up writing a lot of stuff on criminal justice issues, search and seizure, Fourth Amendment, things of that sort. And then kind of pushed my way into trial work and asked them to put me on trials, and I started trying cases.
Yeah, you did a lot of homicides too, I
did
believe.
Homicide cases and some fraud cases and tax fraud against the state, that kind of thing. And then 1980 came around, and Tom Delahanty was becoming U.S. Attorney. He got appointed U.S. Attorney. Jimmy Carter was running for re-election, and Delahanty was the district attorney. And so there was an opening. He's the revolving door. Delahanty was becoming U.S. Attorney because George Mitchell had the job and became a federal judge.
Right.
George Mitchell had taken my father's place as U.S. Attorney when Jimmy Carter came in, something like that. And so when Delahanty became U.S. Attorney for less than a year, I got appointed district attorney and then ran for the job. 3 months later, had to run for the caucus nomination and run for election.
This is Androscoggin County?
Androscoggin,
right?
Franklin, and Oxford counties. So that was an interesting thing, and I was the first woman district attorney in New England, one of the first in the country. There were two others that I know of in the country, and so I got to try other cases other than homicides.
Now, so let's pause there for a second, because you just went from law school to being in the Attorney General's office, and then doing cases and whatnot, and then basically entering politics right there in a weird way, right?
My first political speech was I was district attorney, and I was going to run for the nomination, running for election, standing for election for real. And I stood in front of a small crowd in Lewiston, and there had been a child abuse case months before that, gotten some notoriety. So I told the people who I was, why I was there, what I was going to do as district attorney. And there was a question from the front row. I think it was Bill Jakes at the time. He said, "What's your stand on child abuse?" Oh, I thought long and hard. I said, "I'm against it." This is not rocket science, I thought. I can do this political thing.
That's funny. Well, but it is interesting, though, because when people enter law, oftentimes, they aspire to be a partner in a major law firm or to have, a different sort of legal career path or whatever. But you gravitated towards this elective side and trying to do public service and be a district attorney. What made you? Was it your family that sort of dragged you in that direction?
No, nobody
your
dragged
history
me.
There,
it was happenstance. Life is what happens when you're not paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
This opportunity arose, that opportunity arose, or and honestly, women were not getting the private sector jobs. I'll be quite honest. There were firms in Portland that were just not hiring women attorneys, and I didn't apply. I knew the history in those years, and it wasn't a great one. And I wasn't really attracted to doing private practice at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I went for the public job. And I had worked for Henry Berry for a year during law school. I worked just about every semester during law school, and I didn't want to create a big debt burden, but I worked the last year for Henry Berry, and I started trying cases in the DA's office, and I figured out, whoa, I can do this.
Mm-hmm.
Just pay attention, keep good notes, have an outline, and know the rules of evidence. And it was kind of neat to see the product of your own work and put pieces together like a puzzle and put the evidence together for fact finder, jury, or a judge, and see the results.
Mm. Well, looking at your Wikipedia page, which I see up there, it says that it says on it though that you were the first woman attorney general in New England.
So
it wasn't just Maine.
Attorney, correct.
Excuse me, thank you.
Yeah,
in district attorney in New England. That's quite a feat for somebody who essentially, I think, identified it as a neat pathway to advance her career and go to a place that she could be useful. And you end up being the first in New England. I mean, that's quite a...
Yeah, I didn't think about it too much I wasn't running...
Did you even know about it at the time?
I realized when I got elected that I was the first one in New England, but I didn't think much about it. People used to say, well, what's it like to be a woman district attorney? And I'd say, I don't know. I've never been a male district attorney. Trying to do my job.
Tell you the
that's
difference,
all.
Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting thing about your career, I think. But from there, you ran for re-election a number of times, and you did that job for a while. But then in 1994, you ended up running for a different office, right?
Congress. Yeah. I was. Well, before that, though, I also, friends of mine and I would be going to the legislature on our own, and working on women's issues. I got very involved in women's issues, before I went to law school, and we would go and we'd draft legislation on domestic violence and sexual assault and displaced homemakers, and try to help save people's lives and other good things. And the bills got a great deal of support, and we were all excited. And then we'd turn around and find out that they had died in the back room of the Appropriations Committee on the appropriations table. So a bunch of us, small group of us, Lois Reckitt and Linda Smith Dyer and I got together in my apartment and said, we got to do something about this. Women's voices aren't being heard in the legislature. So we formed what's called the Maine Women's Lobby. And that's been in existence for 4 decades now. We're really proud of what they've done too. And we asked for $2 dues, so we get as many joiners as possible, many members, so we could go to legislators and say, we have 20 people in your district or whatever. And so that worked out. And so I'm proud of that. So 1994 was when George Mitchell in March decided he wasn't going to run again.
Right.
And there was this big whooshing sound, a big sucking sound, and a lot of people ran for Congress in both districts. People ran for U.S. Senate. I think it was when Olympia Snowe ran against Tom Andrews, maybe, for U.S. Senate. And I was one of, I think, 8 people who ran for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District. So that was
to fill Olympia's old seat.
Yes.
And I think that was Pat McGowan got it that year.
No,
he's the one that almost beat Olympia. That's
John
right. Yeah, that was John.
Baldacci.
I forgot about that because at the time I was in middle school and I was actually going to middle school.
Oh, don't tell me that.
I apologize, but I was going to middle school with John's nephew Bobby. Yeah, we went to the same school, and so he was running around with a Baldacci sandwich board. Like in 7th grade, in the lunchroom, which was always fun. But
John Baldacci, Jim Mitchell. Jim Mitchell was now a lobbyist.
That's right.
George's nephew, and a cousin to John Baldacci. The 3 of us were sort of the top contenders, and there were 5 others. And it was a blessedly short campaign. It was only about 12 weeks. We did what we did, and I lost to Baldacci. It obviously had a restaurant, good name recognition, and the rest is history.
The rest is history, indeed. Well, what made you want to do that, though? I mean, you had a fine career already carved out as a district attorney, a pioneer, and all that. You decided, hey, Congress, not a bad place to be. Why did you make that jump?
I'd been district attorney for almost 15 years at that point, and I thought it's time for a change. I had watched Henry Berry in his office in Cumberland County, and I'd seen a guy who'd been there too long. I think I loved Henry; he was a great guy, but he'd been there too long, and I didn't want that to happen to me. So I didn't want to be in one position for too long, and I wanted to find out what else I could do to help the people of Maine. And that opportunity just arose all of a sudden, and I thought, well, why not me?
Why not you? Yeah.
Yep. Nothing that was really planned, premeditated.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you obviously have a political career after that to talk about it as well, but I sort of had forgotten to ask you about this along the way, but now that we're at a point where you're running for Congress and that's what you've decided to do, I guess I should probably ask you. You grew up in a Republican family, and you ended up being a Democrat. At what point were you a self-identified Republican, and then you went to college, or did you decide that while you were still in school? Or
when I first enrolled,
what was the conversion?
When I first registered to vote, I enrolled as a Democrat, and it just seemed like a natural thing to do. And I had traveled some, and I felt like Democrats were doing the right thing.
Was this after your time in San Francisco?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes. Oh, there you go. I could blame it on San Francisco.
And time in D.C., and time in Paris, and time in Boston and Cambridge. And I felt the Democrats were doing the right thing on women's issues, for instance. And, it was at the end of the Vietnam War, and that really polarized a lot of people. And I think a lot of people signed up as Democrats during that period of time too, after we saw what Nixon did and things like that. So in the meantime, when I was district attorney, I also married my husband, Stan. And, I was a career woman in my mid-30s, and no kids, never married. And I met Stan. I was taking tennis lessons from him, and his wife had died and left him with 5 kids, 5 daughters.
Wow.
And in 1985, August of 1985, we got married. We had 5 bridesmaids of different sizes, and they were 4 to 16 when we met. And like 6 to 18 or 16, 6 to 17 when we got married, I think. And, so I helped raise those kids during the time I was district attorney and later as well. And that was an interesting experience. That was an eye-opener of a less political sort. And we're all good friends. I stay in touch with them constantly. And I have 4 grandchildren now, all in the state of Maine. So, and 1 on the way. So that's exciting to me. And those kids, I think, taught me a lot more about love and compassion and relationships than any political experience could ever tell.
Yeah. So on the heels of the loss in 1994, obviously it was a little while between then and when you got elected in 2002 to the state house, to the state legislature. In the meantime,
I went into private practice. My brother had just in 1994. My brother got elected to the state senate, Peter, and so he'd been in private practice all his career. And he was going into politics as a Republican. I was coming out of politics as a Democrat. Right. He needed somebody to work in the law firm, and he was somebody else in the firm had left too to go lobby. So I said, well, that sounds like fun. I'll try that.
Right.
So I was in private practice with Peter for about 14 years. And then eventually we were both in the legislature together for 6 of those years.
Mm-hmm.
One term, both of us in the House of Representatives. That was fun. I was on one end of this, and he was on the other end. And we'd pass notes furiously and try to get things fixed and change legislation. But so we were practicing law and in the legislature together for 6 years. And he got term limited in the Senate. I learned a lot during those years, too, from him and from the good people of Western Maine, representing individuals and small businesses in all kinds of matters, from workers' comp to contract disputes to criminal to family law, everything that walked in the door.
Yeah. Well, talk to me about serving in Maine government during that time, because, obviously in the last decade or so, I mean, it seems like as society has changed a little bit, that looks, just as an observer from the outside, it looks like the Maine legislature and Maine government has changed, as probably I assume most governments out there.
Sure.
It seems a little bit more partisan than it used to be. It seems like people are getting along a little bit worse, and there's a little bit more of what you see in Washington coming.
More lines
coming
drawn
up here,
in the sand.
What was it like working in that time? I mean, this is, I think, still sort of before that really happened. You had obviously a pretty solid Democratic majority the entire time, so you obviously got a lot accomplished. I would
back
say,
and forth. We had
in the House you did.
Well, in one term it was tied.
That was 2004, right?
Joanne Twomey left the party, became an independent. Barbara Merrill, whom I saw recently, she and Phil were in Maine. Barbara resigned as a Democrat, became independent, and somebody else. Oh, Tom Saviello, who's my seatmate. We call each other good brother, bad brother, good sister, bad sister. We get along sometimes, but he was my seatmate, and he dropped out of the Democratic Party, became independent. That was before he became a Republican, ran the Senate. All right. So it was sort of tied, and John Richardson had his hands full trying to figure out the committees and all that kind of thing. And I remember, Tom remembers, I was up all night working on the budget one time, and I was on the budget, I was on the Appropriations Committee for 4 years, and we had to do 7 budgets in 4 years because it was during the recession of 2008 and that kind of thing at one point. I remember working all night one time on the budget and bringing it in the morning and putting it down, and Tom said, "I'm not voting for that." And I put the budget down on the desk and it made a big whap sound. And Richardson was at the podium. He said, "What's wrong with her?" I said, "He's not voting for the budget." Here we have a tie vote, Anyway, it was interesting times because it was during bad economic times.
Sure.
John Baldacci was trying to keep the reins of government tight, and we had to make some serious cuts, but at the same time try to keep basic education funding viable.
Well, there was one year I think the legislature cut something like $500 million out of the budget just because there was nothing, you couldn't pay for anything.
There was nothing. Yeah. That's right. It was bad years, and I learned a lot from those years. Interest rates were going up and down during the early years, 2002 to 2010, and unemployment was higher than certainly that it is now. Mm-hmm. So we had to make some serious decisions, and we did it. And, you had to work across the aisle. I worked with Republicans like Carl Turner and Solomon Millett and Steve Bowen on the Appropriations Committee, and we got stuff done. It wasn't pleasant, but we got things done, and that was the name of the game. So I also was on Judiciary Committee for 4 years. The last 2 years I was on the Judiciary Committee and the Appropriations Committee, and I was practicing law full time. So I had headphones on like you do right now and listening to the Judiciary Committee, paying attention to appropriations, and on my laptop typing memos to clients and stuff,
I can relate to this, yes.
Yeah. Got a lot of stuff done.
Well, then after some time there, obviously, you were elected Attorney General in, I think it was like December of 08, right at the very end of 08. And then began a new. So I guess you're back in the Attorney General's office now, where you began, right? Only now
I was
you're
in
the top
for 2 years. As people know, the constitutional officers in Maine are elected by the legislature. So I was elected in 2008, served for 2 years. The legislature flipped and went Republican in 2010. It's when Paul LePage was elected, and the Republicans took over the legislature.
Then you had Bill Schneider in that spot for 2 years.
2 years, and I consider him a good friend, and we had a good transition, a smooth transition. And then I came back in 2012, ran again, and won when the Democrats had taken back the Senate and the House for one term, and the House for Anyway.
And then it went back to the Senate flipped again after that.
It's the overall majority that counts in terms of the constitutional officers. I also got.
Do you like that, by the way? I don't mean to interrupt you, but do you like the way that we elect the Attorney General and the Secretary of State and the Treasurer?
I just want to say I didn't get elected just by Democrats. I got elected by Republicans and independents too. And I certainly didn't ignore them. I never ignore them. I try to work with all the parties in the legislature as Attorney General and as a candidate.
Yeah.
But do I like it? Well,
would you do it different if you drew it up from scratch? Would you do it that way?
I might if there was public funding. I don't like the idea of an Attorney General running for the state's chief legal office. Mm-hmm. At any given time, we have about 7,000 matters pending. 7,000 matters pending all over the state. You read about the most visible things in the newspaper, but there's a lot more to it. And I'm not opposed to the idea of public elections, popular election of the Attorney General or of other constitutional officers. It's unlikely to happen as a political reality because the legislature is
it'll never change.
Not going to give up its authority, its power. So there's that.
The reason I ask you is because obviously, and we can get into your time as Attorney General because I think it's most important for your run for governor, obviously. But you've had some public discussions with the governor, obviously, about I know about being the Attorney General and the governor and the relationship between the two. Would it be a more healthy relationship to have the Attorney General maybe appointed even by the governor so that they're working together rather than
that was suggested. If you read James Madison, you'll see a lot of reasons why not to concentrate power in the hands of the few. But also there are 5 states. It was 5 where the governor appoints the Attorney General. And in some of those states, like New Jersey, they had 5 different attorneys general in 5 years. In Alaska, they had 5 different attorneys general, I think 6 years. There was no consistency, that didn't make a lot of sense to me, to have the Attorney General working sort of almost personally for the governor, the sitting governor. So there are pros and cons. Yeah, I think it's important to have some independence in that office, and to make sure that the Attorney General of whatever party he or she serves is married to the rule of law. First and foremost, you take an oath. We're often asked, why don't you hire outside counsel for this, that, the other thing? You know what? My office and I took an oath to uphold the Constitution and statutes of this country and the United and of the state, and that's an important oath to me. And it means upholding the rule of law. I often describe it as, there are 3 branches of government, and they're like the rafters of an old Maine barn. And I think the constitutional officers are like the I-beam of the barn, holding those branches together, like the glue, the thing that makes it work. To me, however visible or invisible those jobs may be, they should have independence, and they should be. You're elected by the legislature, but you don't serve the legislature either. And you appear in front of the judiciary, and you actually serve the judiciary too. And you serve the executive branch as well, and you give them the best legal advice you possibly can. And there's the people in the Attorney General's office, I don't hire them for political reasons. Nobody's done that really in recent decades that I know of. They are professional. They are career advocates for the people of the state of Maine. And that's the way it should be.
Well, as you look back on the time that you've served, both in that first little 2-year term and then since when you returned back to the Attorney General's office, and you look at what you've done there, what are you most proud of, and what is it that you point at when people ask you about your time there?
Well, I think protecting the rule of law is most important, whether that's an argument, a litigation over health care or education or consumer rights, just protecting the rule of law, making sure that there are checks and balances in state government, and that the people's rights are protected. We've done, and I don't talk about this much, but at any given time, we have about 2,000 child protection cases where we are in court every day trying to protect the health and safety of Maine's children. That's an important aspect of what we do in our work. We don't talk about it because they're protected, confidentiality laws protect those cases. At any given time, we have about 2,000 child support matters where we're collecting money on behalf of needy parents and restitution to the state for benefits paid out. We have several thousand consumer cases. I've gone around the state. I've worked with the AARP. I've worked with many institutions and agencies to help protect people from fraud and major scams. Every week, literally hundreds of thousands of dollars are leaving the state of Maine. People are getting ripped off by these quiet but horrible frauds. The Canadian lottery scam, the grandparents scam, all those things. So part of what I've tried to do is public education too, making sure people don't lose their hard-earned savings. So I'm proud of that too. But particularly proud of standing up, I believe, for the rule of law, standing up for the checks and balances of state government to make sure that power is not concentrated in one body or another.
What moment was it that you made your decision to run for governor? What was your motivating factor? Why did you think that you were stepping into a place that just wasn't being filled by other people?
I think it was a bit incremental. It was gradual. And probably early last year, I began to think more seriously about it. And then there was the state shutdown, kind of paralyzing everything. And I couldn't make any move then. It wouldn't have been right. It was after the state shutdown that I decided I'm going to go for this.
Mm-hmm.
I think I can do it. It wasn't something I planned to do for years in advance. I wasn't a born politician. Honestly, I wasn't. And but I think I can do this. I feel confident about doing it. I feel confident about making some serious changes, and I'm also optimistic about the state of Maine. I've seen a lot of awfully good things happen, and learned about a lot of good things happening in the state of Maine, and I want to promote that too. I want to be the promoter in chief for the state of Maine. I want to tell the world what a great place we are, what a great group of people, great work ethic, great natural resources. Yeah.
Obviously, people have been speculating about your potential run for governor for longer than you made that decision, though. I mean,
well, when you're in public office, they do that.
They do, but you did become one of the chief targets of Governor LePage of criticism. I mean, he obviously, Mark Eves and yourself were probably the two biggest that I can think of in the time that he's been in office that he sort of targeted with criticism, and still to this day is doing an awful lot with you. When you look back on that relationship with the current governor, and you look back at some of that time that you've been serving in government alongside him, what do you see in his administration? Is there any good that you identify that was there, and what did you disagree the most vehemently about?
Well, I think the disagreements have been very public. I don't need to dwell on those, frankly, but I agreed with him, for instance, on prescription of opioids. I had been talking to the medical community for a number of years about, capping the prescribing of opioids. At one point, 2014, 2015, Maine had the highest number of prescriptions of oxycodone and Oxycontin of any state in the country. We had about more than 1.2 million prescriptions written.
That's as a raw number, not as a per capita?
Both. No, at per capita.
Well, it would certainly be per capita.
Right, because in New York State, they'd be different. But we had at least almost one prescription for opioids for every man, woman, and child in the state of Maine. That's appalling. And there seemed to be no effort to wean people off of those drugs. And we know that 3/4 of heroin users started using prescription drugs, opioids. So it was really important to cap the prescribing practices. Finally, the governor put the bill in 2-3 years ago now, and I applauded it. I testified for it. I lobbied for it. And only he could have done that. Only he could have put that bill in, which became Chapter 488, I think, to tell the prescribers across the state that, A, you have to cap the daily dosages of opioids, and B, you have to cap the duration of those prescriptions, 10 days for acute, 30 days for chronic, something like that. And C, you've got to check the prescription monitoring program before you write a prescription for opioids. And D, engage in electronic prescribing. Start using the computers. And it's the first bill in the country to do all of those things. So I applaud him for that. He pushed it through. Mary Mayhew was commissioner. She helped push it through. Gordon Smith, head of the Maine Medical Association, came to the table, brought the docs to the table, and it got done. It's had some, it's been amended since then, moderated some, but people are getting weaned off those heavy dose prescriptions. We found that 16,000 people in Maine were on prescriptions of at least 300 milligrams of opiates a day. That's enormous. And there's no research that shows that long-term prescribing of opiates actually alleviates pain. So I applaud him for that. He got that done.
Well, when you're asking, when I'm asking about that question, I'm not just asking about policy too. I mean, there's been like a movement, obviously, in politics in the last 10 years or so, searching for more authenticity, more real people, I guess you see.
Real peeps. Okay.
Yeah, well, you know what I mean by that.
Yeah, yeah.
It seems somebody who feels more like, somebody who's not a polished politician.
Mm-hmm.
That's more like you might encounter in your everyday life. What do you think of that movement? I mean, is it missing the boat? There's some people on both the right and the left. I've heard talk about how misplaced that might be. How you're looking for people that are experienced and educated and know the system in and out, and they're the ones that can really make change happen. And then you have people that want an outside perspective, right?
You can be educated and still be real. I think.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a dichotomy there. I mean, hopefully I'm a real person. I'm not a professional politician. I'm someone who's, I think, stood up for the people of Maine from the outside and looking in and dealing with the politicians in Augusta and just trying to make sure that, they abide by the rule of law. I think people admire, they see Paul LePage as someone who's blunt and direct speaking, as it were.
Yeah.
And I also applaud what he did with the hospitals, paying off the hospitals.
I guess that's what I was getting at to some degree, is that, you're so used to politicians, at least I am, that are well rehearsed. They have consultants tell them what to say and what to do, and they have a press release that's prepared and all that other stuff. And they don't risk being mildly offensive occasionally or saying what's really on their mind. They are very, very careful. And I think that's what we've seen a lot in politicians. Yeah. But frankly, I think Bernie Sanders fits that too. I mean, it's on the left also. It feels like he's a more authentic person, just in terms of personality.
He's been in politics longer than almost anybody.
Yeah, he has. He has. He was mayor of Burlington back in the, I think, 70s or the 60s. So definitely. Is that a misplaced desire on the voters' part, or? I
like to see people who speak their mind. Yeah. I hope people see me as someone who speaks her mind. I think I've done that pretty well, pretty frequently regularly in my public life and in my private life too. I think, when I see people on the street, they'll tell me bluntly, I like what you did on that. I don't like what you did on that. We'll discuss it and say, here's where I'm coming from. If you think I'm wrong, I'm happy to look at things differently and see if we should change things.
We're speaking with Janet Mills, who is the Democratic candidate for governor running this year in the gubernatorial contest. And we're speaking, of course, with all the candidates running for this office to get a little more information on who they are and what their motivations are. And, we've been talking a little bit just a moment ago about sort of what voters want and what they don't want. And one of the biggest criticisms you hear from people that are running against you today are the career politician thing, which is that you've been involved in this for a long time. You've been doing a lot of public service in your life. How do you respond to that? I mean, is that an unfair criticism?
Well, I don't think, I was district attorney for 15 years. I don't think anybody ever accused me of being political in that job. The DAs aren't looked upon as being politicians, even though it's an elected office. I've been in law enforcement, and I was in private practice for 14 years. I've been in the private sector and I've been in the public sector. And in both capacities, I think I've ably, hopefully honestly, and professionally stood up for people, stood up for Maine people. I believe strongly in the values that Maine people hold dear, that we all hold dear, the value of hard work, the value of, integrity and honesty in whatever you do in your private life and your public life. And I want to stand up for those people as governor. I want to make sure that we have one Maine, not two Maines or three Maines. I want to make sure that people have opportunity all around the state of Maine, whether they live in a rim county or the northern counties or southern counties, that I think I know how to get stuff done. Mm-hmm. I think I've done that as Attorney General.
That phrase is important to me, though, because I always struggle with this myself. I don't know what I want.
You don't like to get things done?
No. I mean, I don't know what I want sometimes. I really do value outsiders that have a perspective and they haven't been in government for a long time. But I also really value people that kind of know where the bodies are buried and they can tell you how to get something accomplished and know who to reach out to and how to do it and when to do it. And it seems like this constant struggle in my brain on what's actually the best way to go about it.
Yeah, I think people want someone who has some modicum of experience, some level of experience. I mean, if you're going to have gallbladder surgery, you don't hire somebody who's never done it before, frankly. You hire somebody who has the skills and experience to do it and do it right and not risk your life. And but you also want somebody who shares your values in public life. When you're electing somebody, you want somebody who shares your values. And I think I have the values that reflect the values of Maine people,
Mm-hmm.
and also the ability to get things done. I know where the bathrooms are in State House. I know I know what the budget looks like. I've done
How the process works.
Yeah,
and,
for better or for worse. And I've worked across the aisle. That's important. I want to make sure the door is open. I'm going to be, hopefully, elected governor. If I'm privileged to be elected the governor of people of the state of Maine, I'll have an open door, open mind, and open heart.
Mm-hmm.
And all comers are welcome, people from all parties and all levels of experience. What I loved about being in the House of Representatives, and if people haven't run before, they should think about running, despite this particular session, because it's been pretty hard. You sit there and you think you have ideas about how the world should run. And you sit there and you hear from a farmer in Newport, and you hear from a insurance salesman in Bangor, and you hear from a teacher in Kidder. You hear from people from all walks of life, all ages. You hear from a Louis Lucchini, who's a runner, and an athlete. You hear from people of all parties, people with great ideas, and you learn so much. And you begin to absorb what other people have experienced in their lives and say, you know what, maybe I should look at this a little differently. And that's how you make public policy. You sit at the table, you do it the old-fashioned way, you share ideas, share information, and you get the job done for the Maine people.
And that sort of dovetails into the question I wanted to ask. I've asked this of all the candidates, but to some degree, all of you say, and I think genuinely want, to kind of break the logjam a little bit and get people back to work, reach across the aisle, get something done.
Yeah.
How do you do that in the environment we have today? Even if you're the best, even if you're the absolute best candidate that we have, is the system itself maybe a little bit broken so that it's impossible for even a good person who's in that job to really get people reaching across the aisle, working together, and pushing the rock all uphill at the same time? We
have a part-time legislature, and they're good people, and you got to know where they're coming from. I think it's important that you meet people where they are. You have lunch with leaders and rank and file people regularly. You find out about them and their families. There's been too little of that. When George Mitchell became Senate Majority Leader in the U.S. Senate in Washington, he met with Bob Dole, and the two of them reached across the aisle and they shook hands and they agreed that no matter how tough things got during the day, they would always leave the chamber as friends. They would always break bread in the evening. They would always have coffee together in the morning and keep talking. And that is critical. No matter who you are and what walk of life you're in, you have to keep talking. I believe, despite the fact that I'm a lawyer and we do a lot of litigation, I believe a lot more can be accomplished by communication than by litigation. And there's a litigious atmosphere in Augusta right now. I'd like to break through that.
Well, isn't some of it related to us crazy voters and how we're asking the people that we're elected to behave? I mean, I'm thinking right now of the average conservative voter, and I know that it's not really something that they're all that interested in, to have everybody be buddy with each other up there. Like, they think that means compromising what their beliefs are and giving in, and then making bad law and whatnot. And I think having listened to my share of really, I think, left-leaning voters as well, I think there's a similar kind of mindset there as well, where we're tired of giving in on this and giving in on that and stop compromising. Let's just stand firm on and bold colors and believe what we believe and really try to accomplish something. That's why I asked the question, because I feel like if you get there, you're going to be encountering those people that were elected by those voters, and it's almost in their own best interest as lawmakers now to play to that, isn't it?
And that's why we've had so many referenda in recent years too.
Yeah.
People on all sides are kind of fed up with this stalemate going on in Augusta, and they're turning to the ballot box in another way. They're writing referenda and initiatives and people's vetoes and taking it to the people directly, whether it's marijuana, ranked choice voting, other in past years, Tabor and things of that sort. And I think you avoid that, because there are issues related to that too. You avoid that by bringing people to the table and talking about what's their bottom line, what is it they want to achieve. You don't have to exchange slogans all the time and sling mud and that kind of thing. That's not necessary. I believe you can do it with civility, with intelligence, and with passion. Compromise isn't a bad word, but compromise isn't the end result necessarily either. There's always a third way to get things done. There's always some other, not necessarily a middle ground, but there's a third way to get things done without polarizing people and parties and without alienating those people's base. Such too.
Well, assuming your governorship, were you to win, goes how you want it, why are you running? Like, I asked you when you made the decision, and you sort of touched on it a little bit, but why are you running, and what do you want to accomplish?
Well, I grew up in Western Maine, and I grew up in a Republican family. I've always been a Democrat, however, and I grew up with values that relate to compassion, community, connectivity. I want to bring those values back to the State House. I want to bring those values back to state government. And I think the people of Maine want a leader who reflects those values. I grew up in a town where you had town meeting every March, you still do, where things are hashed out openly and you take a vote and then people walk away. Maybe they go for a sandwich afterwards. I want to make sure that kind of atmosphere is present in Augusta, that we get things done the old-fashioned way. But I also want to see, the economic divide in Maine is real. I visit Portland. I can't afford to live in Portland, but there's a lot going on here. And Cumberland County is like the economic engine of Maine, but there are jobs going, there's employment going without because of the nature of the workforce needs. We've got to beef up our workforce. We've got to be a more welcoming state, to encourage young people to come back here and grow their families here, raise their families here. And in the rim counties in northern Maine and eastern Maine, we've got to provide them with a good employment base. We're not going to be able to bring back the paper mills, but we can do things differently. I'm excited that the number 3 paper machine in Jay is being retrofitted to make cardboard for Amazon. I'm excited that we're still making Legos and baseball bats and log homes and whatnot, but we're also doing other things differently. And we've got to find new jobs, new enterprises, and encourage entrepreneurship elsewhere in the state. I think part of that is investing in infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, but cell phone reception, and broadband. We all talk about broadband. As I go around the state, I'm hearing a lot of positive efforts about broadband. I know that the governor can lead in developing a statewide strategy for broadband that will encourage investment in Washington County, Piscataquis County, and Aroostook County. So those are some of my goals. Clean energy is big. Renewable energy. We have the opportunity to do solar power and do it right. We have the opportunity to do offshore wind and bring a lot of good-paying jobs to Maine through those efforts. We have fewer than 600 jobs in solar energy in Maine. Massachusetts down the road, and I don't always look to them for an example, but they have more than 14,000 jobs in solar energy. And most of the people working those jobs are young millennials who are proud of what they do. They're productive. And a lot of them would like to come to Maine and do what they're doing in Massachusetts, and I'd like to have them come here.
You mentioned a moment ago the opioid crisis and sort of your perspective on what needs to be done and what has been done already. I'm not going to ask specifically, I guess, about the opioid crisis because that's for, I think, a broader policy talk. But it is probably one of the top 2 or 3 things that most people in the state would identify as, big problem we got to solve. One of the big... And
healthcare and the cost of healthcare generally, which is what the Chamber of Commerce and Maine Development Foundation just acknowledged in their recent report, that the biggest thing on 1,000 employers' minds is the cost of healthcare. And that includes the cost of the opiate epidemic, the economic cost, the human cost. And I think I'm the only candidate who's actually published a 10-point plan back in January, a 10-point plan to address the opiate epidemic on day 1. And it involves naloxone, Narcan, which I've given out to 83 different police departments. As of this week, we've had more than 500 saves just with that Narcan through the police departments. Now what we need is a different triage system. When people are revived from an opioid overdose, then we need recovery coaches on standby, on call. We need medication-assisted treatment. We've got to turn their lives, or help them turn their lives around, become productive citizens again. We need public education. We need prevention measures that really work, and efforts in the schools and in the communities to make sure our young people don't turn to drugs. So I've got a 10-point plan. I don't need to spend an hour going into that because we'd be here all day. But it's a keen priority of mine, a keen interest of mine, and I really want to step into the reins of government to solve that.
Well, again, we're not going to get into too much policy stuff here today, but I am curious about sort of your philosophy on how you'd like to manage the government and run the government too, because obviously you have, a plan in that regards, and I think there's no way of getting around beefing up what DHHS does probably in that regard with some additional funding if you want to do it that way. When you add that to your energy priorities and a few other things, you're talking about cost. How do you balance that in your own mind? I'm not going to ask you specifically what your tax policy is going to be and all that jazz.
$7.1 billion, but yeah.
But how do you think that Maine is uncompetitive and that things need to be addressed on that side as well? I mean, how do you do that while funding those priorities?
Well, not everything needs general fund funds. First, we've got to look at our competitive advantages, and we've got to tell the world what a great place we are and what great people and good work ethic and wonderful natural resources. And I'm convinced that we encourage people to come here. They will come here. We will have sustainable businesses here and new people to fill the jobs we have. And I'm excited about that. When you do that, the economic base expands. You have more people paying taxes here. You don't have to sit around and talk about increasing taxes all the time. I'm not going to do that. I want to expand the economic base of the state of Maine. And I think health care is part of that. And I think expanding Medicaid is part of that, because when you expand Medicaid, you're saving those dozen or so rural hospitals that are on the brink of failure, and you're providing thousands of good jobs and retaining thousands of good jobs. And incidentally, the cost shift that goes on now, because there's such a high level of uncompensated care, so the hospitals and providers are passing that cost on to the private insurers and the people without insurance. So that has to, by definition, bring down the cost of insurance too, health insurance for individuals and small businesses. I'm hoping that will happen too. And I just think, our economic base is going to expand with clean energy, with medical costs. We've turned back, the state of Maine has turned back nearly $2 billion in federal funds in the last 7.5 years. Not just health care, but funds for the forest legacy money and other things in the healthcare arena, like colorectal cancer testing funds, federal funds, Alzheimer's treatment funds. Why would we turn that back? There's money out there. Why would we send it to another state? It's our tax dollars. Why not?
Was it ever bad to say no to that? I mean, I know. Is it ever bad to say, or ever good to say no to it? Because I'm thinking of some of the things that Governor LePage has said no to, and I know he's turned away some federal dollars on like job retraining and things like that because he claims there's like 9 other programs that do it and it's duplicative and redundant. Would you just blanket accept, I guess, federal funds no matter what the sources comes from?
Most of them, they're going to go to some other state. I'm sure there are creative ways to use those funds and specified ways. Who turns back colorectal cancer testing money? Hello? We have a very high cancer rate in the state of Maine. We have one of the highest bladder cancer rates in the state of Maine. We have high lung cancer rates. We have high childhood asthma rates. Why would we not want to protect people? And that's one reason, as Attorney General, I have fought the federal government when it comes to ozone, when it comes to mercury and airborne toxics rules, when it comes to the Clean Power Plan, because we're at the tailpipe of all those pollutants from the Midwestern states, and I want to make sure we protect our kids from that kind of pollution too. That's, federal funds are available for a lot of things. Brownfields, we could be using brownfields money to retrofit some of the old mill properties and turn them into data warehouses or other productive generators of income and jobs in the state of Maine. I want to look for new and creative ways to do that and pair those things with geothermal so that we're self-sustaining. I toured the backyard farms recently in Madison. 42 acres of greenhouses growing tomato. We could be doing that in Aroostook County. We could be growing tomatoes, lettuce, all kinds of things year round. We are the breadbasket of New England. We can be more in that respect too.
Well, obviously you're running against a number of candidates. There's 2 independents that are running. There's also Sean Moody in the Republican side. As you survey the field and you know yourself and your experience and your perspective and what issues you want to pursue as governor, how do you compare yourself to them? Why is it that you are the best choice out of the candidates that are running?
Look, I think people know what I've done. They know where I'm coming from. They know that I have roots and tentacles all over Maine, including Gorham. I joked with Sean last year. We had lunch because I wanted to find out what it was like to be on the university trustees and the community colleges board as well. And I thought that was interesting. I'd like to do more of that pairing. And he joked that he might run for governor. I said, well, I might too, so we could split the Gorham vote. But I think I've done a lot I've accomplished a lot, both as Attorney General and in the private sector. And people know that I'm serious about this, that I have a background in balancing budgets. I have run an executive agency with a $42 million budget. I think I've done pretty well there. I know how to manage a budget. I know how to move people forward and get the best for Maine people. I'm not going to criticize any of the other people running for governor. I'm running for the position, not running against somebody else in particular. I'm running to be the best governor that Maine has hopefully ever been.
I've been listening to a lot of political analysts sort of break down this race, and it's silly because we're doing this interview, of course, in the end of July, and people will hear it a little bit later. But they are, making note of the fact that this gubernatorial race does not have ranked choice voting in it, so it's going to be a straight vote like normal.
It's exactly where people wanted to have ranked choice voting, but that's the pesky Constitution for you.
Sure, but you're looking at a field, and you have two what I would consider left-leaning independents that are in the race. Obviously, former Democrat.
Terry Hayes is left-leaning? I'm not.
Well, she was a Democrat for a while, so there's at least that to throw on the resume. But I'm sure you can make a case. Don't mistake me. But what I'm suggesting is that to the general public, at least that's the perception right now, today. Are you worried about that? Do you think that there's going to be any sort of vote splitting in this kind of race or anything like that?
Maine has a long history of having independent candidates run for governor and other offices, and sometimes they make a difference, sometimes they don't. I'm hoping that people won't peel off, people won't not vote for me because of somebody else. I'm hoping to vote for me, and I think I'm a pretty strong candidate. I'm working at this day and night and doing the best job I can as a candidate, hoping to do the best job I can as governor.
Do you think that the national environment will have any sort of impact on us locally here? Because it seems like year to year it sometimes does, sometimes doesn't.
I'm not a political analyst as you are, but...
well, there's a lot of big things happening in the country. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, tends to be a swing. I think what's happening with the Supreme Court, what may happen with the Supreme Court, sort of turning to the right, makes people think more about state elections, makes people think, well, you got to take this a lot more seriously, because it may well be that the preservation of some of our basic fundamental rights, including women's rights and the environmental protection and civil rights, may be in the hands of the state governors, and that we may well be the last line of defense in some of these areas. And so people are taking these elections a lot more seriously.
Yeah, I was also asking about the thought that maybe more people might be really excited and turn out this year, so the turnout might look a little different than it might 2 years ago or 2 years before that.
I hope there is a good turnout. A good turnout is always healthy for democracy.
Well, we're wrapping up on the questions I had for you, but one of the big ones left on and in my mind is it's really sort of conceptual. I mean, as you look back 4 years or 8 years, depending on how long you'd be in office if you were to win, on your tenure, you're looking back. What is it you want to say that you've accomplished? What was the Mills administration's legacy? What was it all about after all things are said and done?
Trick question. Ooh.
I know. It's always an interesting one to think about too, because you think about what you want to do, but what do you want to be remembered for? 50 years from now, the big ticket.
I think
conceptual thing.
In 2020, we're going to celebrate the bicentennial of the state of Maine, even earlier than the time period you're talking about. We'll also be celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. I hope to be there as governor, sitting in the Blaine House and the State House, celebrating those two events concurrently. And hopefully, at the end of my term, however long it may be, I hope to celebrate renewal of health and economic prosperity all across the state of Maine. I hope that we'll be seeing ourselves as I see Maine, my vision of Maine as a state undivided, as a state that is prosperous and healthy north to south and west to east. That's what I envision for the state of Maine, for the people of the state of Maine.
Yeah, I mean, my other question really was going to be to give me your elevator pitch. What is it that's in 30 seconds or a minute, exactly what the main reason is to vote for Janet Mills? And this is, I think, a version of that, isn't it? It's probably something like looking back, that's what you want to accomplish, that's what you want it to be.
Yeah. I'm somebody who likes to get things done, and I have the know-how to get the job done. I have the vision of Maine. I see us turning in a new direction. I want to take Maine in a new direction. There's been some good things that happened in recent years, but some things that I would not have done that way. I'm hoping to turn us around and move us in a new direction so that we are welcoming to young families, so that people are excited about moving to Maine or moving back to Maine. I have 4 grandchildren here in the state of Maine. 2 of them are going to graduate from high school next year. They want to leave the state of Maine.
Yeah.
I'm happy to have them leave, but be happy to have them come back. And I want to make sure they have that opportunity. I know people say that often in a campaign season, but I'm serious about it. I want to make sure my grandkids come back to Maine, have a place to live, and have as good paying jobs here as they could find in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and elsewhere. And I want them to grow their families here and keep our natural resources, keep our population healthy, and establish a level of prosperity across the state of Maine.
Yeah, I think those are things that most of us agree with. So certainly, if you were to get elected, I hope that all comes true. Jana Mills, Democratic candidate for governor, has been nice enough to spend an hour with us here in studio at WGAN, giving us a little bit of a peek into what makes her brain tick and what she wants to do for the state if she were to get elected. I want to say thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Matt.
Very much appreciated. And we'll be back again with more from WGAN.